Hello and welcome to Climate Futures from the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at the University of Oxford. My name is Dave Vetter, and throughout this series I'll be speaking to researchers, leaders and thinkers about how we can build a future for ourselves on the planet we call home. This requires nothing less than a reimagining of our relationship with the Earth. Today we're talking about the end of fire. Fire has enabled human civilization, but can it also spell the end of it, as the burning of fossil fuels leads to increasingly unlivable temperatures? How do we move on from what one of our guests today has called the Pyrocene, the age of fire, and to a place of regeneration and renewal? To answer this, I am joined today by two extraordinary guests. I'd like to introduce international best-selling author John Valliant, winner of the Baillie Gifford Prize for his incredible non-fiction book Fire Weather, a true story from a hotter world, about the 2016 Fort McMurray fire in Canada. Hey John, how's it going and where are you joining us from?
I'm in sunny and very hot Dallas, where we're breaking temperature records almost daily. Good to be with you.
Okay, and also joining us is legal scholar Ben Franta, Senior Research Fellow in Climate Litigation at the Oxford Sustainable Law Programme and the founding head of the Climate Litigation Lab. Ben, thanks for joining us. Where in the world are you?
Thanks, Dave. I'm in an increasingly dark Oxford right now, so very different from where John is.
Now, to set the scene for our conversation, I'd like to read an excerpt from Fire Weather from the author himself, if he doesn't mind. Currently, we live in a dangerously bifurcated reality, where senior executives at forward-thinking, publicly traded companies like Exxon, Shell, JP Morgan and the Bank of England accept the science of anthropogenic carbon dioxide and the threat it poses, and still continue to literally pour gas on the flames. This behavioural dissonance reveals a glitch in human nature. Once an arbitrary standard has been set for production profits and their attendant gratification, that expectation, however unsustainable, becomes the new baseline, and anyone attempting to revise it or even question it faces serious social and economic consequences. John, as the author of those words, can you talk a bit about how this equation is defining our world and our reality?
Well, we're kind of existing in these two parallel tracks, and I think the financial system, our notion of, we call it capitalism, call it our current economic system, has a definition of what profit is and an accepted means of achieving those profits that really have nothing to do with the carrying capacity of planet Earth or any of the species upon it or the atmosphere, surrounding it. So there's, that is, from the outside looks like a kind of madness, where you have this kind of selective way of being that is so clearly and demonstrably at odds with the planet and the conditions that support it. So that is a puzzle to me. And I think what's happening right now, the moment we're in right now, is the tension in that dissonance is growing steadily more shrill. And so as we see disasters more easily attributable directly to excess CO2, excess methane, and then listen to petroleum company CEOs, energy CEOs, automotive CEOs talk about growth in quite sunny terms, we just hear these two kind of different voices that are almost talking over each other. And I think we experience that even in very partisan politics, where you'll have, say the left and the right and in polarized positions, just speaking as if they live in different worlds, but they're, clearly we're all bound to the same fate. And that is, that's kind of the challenge to how do we harmonize that? And what's the mechanism that we can bring the financial system and the expectations of a profitable business model into line with the very, very hard and increasingly rigid limitations of nature?
Now, elsewhere, you've described humanity's use of fossil fuels as an addiction, and that captured my attention. So, what tools do we have to end that addiction?
Frankly, to me, what it feels like when I kind of step back and take a Martian view of the situation, it really looks like we've been on a 150-year Coke binge when it comes to petroleum. And it's incredibly exhilarating. And Monday morning is really painful. And it's Monday, it is Monday on planet Earth. And we are, and so we have to go back though and reckon with what an amazing weekend that was, because some really fantastic, spectacular things happened. And I'm not, it sounds flip, but we do need to have a reckoning with what petroleum has given us. And it has been enormous, really beautiful, terrific things that have clearly changed our lives in the world. And now we need to also reckon with the costs of that. And that's where, CO2 has been this sort of silent partner in all of this that's been sort of slowly growing and massing. And I can sort of, metaphorically kind of pushing us out of the frame as with the heat and attendant disasters that it enables. And so that's, we're getting squeezed between those two forces right now.
Right, so there's a bill coming due. I'd like to turn to Ben Franta, who may have some answers as to the sorts of tools we might be able to use to redefine this relationship. Ben, as a law scholar, you're coming at the fossil fuel industry from the legal angle. Can you give us a quick rundown of climate litigation in 2024? What is it and what can it achieve?
Well, sure. Thanks, Dave. And maybe before I get into that, I'm just, I'm really struck by John's remarks, and I'm reminded of a phrase that historian Robert J. Lifton coined. And he called it malignant normality. And that's what he used to describe the normalization of nuclear war during the Cold War, something that was objectively insane, but made to seem normal. And hence this phrase malignant normality. And as you said, John, the first step is to identify that there's a problem, that what is being treated as normal is in fact not normal or shouldn't be normal. And I see climate change as having many parallels to the threat of nuclear weapons, and how climate change has been normalized. And really, when we look at the industry's own internal documents, and I'm talking about oil companies like Exxon, back in the 70s and 80s, they understood climate change very well. And they described the impacts of climate change in terms similar to what a nuclear war would do to the Earth. The difference is the nuclear weapons industry or whatever military industrial complex never actually implemented that nuclear war, but the fossil fuel industry did implement its plans, which it knew would cause global catastrophe. And so I think there are these existential parallels between, what happened in the second half of the 20th century with Cold War and, what's happening now in terms of the scale of the catastrophe and it's really a psychological trauma, just like, people experienced during the Cold War that has lifelong impacts, the normalization of what was really traumatic. And now that's occurring again. And so, that's just sort of maybe a frame for how to get into the litigation stuff, because the litigation is one of the correctives. It's one of the remedies. It's one of the ways to say what's happening now is not normal and it shouldn't be normal and it should be corrected through law. That's one mechanism, a very powerful instrument for creating change in society. So, climate litigation has been around for decades, actually, but in the last 10 years, it's become a lot bigger. And that's because we've seen some new types of cases emerge around the world. We've seen cases for climate damages. So this is actually trying to get the fossil fuel companies to pay for the damage caused by climate change. And as you can imagine, that damage is enormous. It's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, as has been estimated by scientists and economists. So, that's enormous. We're seeing lawsuits that are trying to compel governments and fossil fuel companies to cut emissions in line with the Paris Climate Agreement, and that's also enormous. And we're seeing a lot of human rights actions and developments around the world too to make climate action part of human rights law because of the wide-ranging impacts of climate change.
So, Ben, I just want to jump in here and ask, what about homicide charges? There was a terrible heat wave in Phoenix, Arizona in 2023, which, killed a measurable number of people. The heat dome in British Columbia in 2021, there were 700 deaths attributable to the heat, which was unprecedented in that part of the world. And these deaths were determined by the coroner to be caused by these intense temperatures.
Absolutely. There are lawyers that are developing those cases as we speak for climate homicide. In the law, at least in U.S. law, there's a crime called depraved heart murder, and it's basically when someone has such a wanton disregard for human life that they act in a very dangerous way without care for how their actions might hurt or kill other people. And even if they don't actually intend to kill other people or want to kill other people, they're doing so without really caring that they're doing so. And that's just one example of a crime. But some have argued that the actions of fossil fuel executives over the years they've amounted to that sort of mindset where they understood that their product was going to kill an enormous number of people around the world and cause irreversible impacts, and then they went ahead and promoted that product anyway and told people not to worry about it. And so, what is the mindset behind that accompanies those really dangerous actions?
Literally, while Canada was burning from coast to coast to coast in 2023, the CEO of Suncor, went on the record saying, we're in the business to make as much money as possible, and this was while they were selling off their viable renewable energy business and firing 1,500 workers, and this focus on profit and on solidifying their position and consolidating their position is so cynical, and there really doesn't seem to be any effort now to cover it up. I mean, greenwashing is almost feeling quaint and passé now compared to some of the statements that prominent CEOs, Sile Wyon and Darren Woods, have made to the press. These aren't stolen recordings from private meetings. This is how we do business now, folks, and our shareholders love it.
Another phrase by another historian, Robert Proctor from Stanford University. And I'm a former student of his, and he used to point out his belief that most evil in history is a result of people inverting their profession with their humanity.
Wow.
Wow. So Ben, from your perspective, and presumably you're following these cases rather closely, do you see homicide cases getting any traction anytime soon? What needs to happen for those to be effective?
I think we might see cases like that. The impacts of climate change are getting worse and worse, of course, and so that's driving more and more litigation. And science has a role to play here because scientific research is one of the ways we can quantify what the damage actually is. Economic damage, yes, but also human health impacts. How many people are affected by an extreme heat wave or a storm that wouldn't have happened as intensely without climate change. So that scientific component is really important, and that's developing all the time as well. So I think there's absolutely scope for some criminal charges associated with climate change. We'll see we'll see if that actually happens.
I think some really effective evidence could be found in insurance records. And just the fact that these companies that are nonpartisan, that are driven by raw data, are pulling out of regions where historically insurance was perfectly accessible and normal to get. And now they're saying we're not doing that anymore. And that to me implies a radical shift in the state of that place. And I think I don't know if you could prosecute a case solely on the basis of insurance data, but it certainly is like a powerful leg to hold up that particular table, if you will. And I'm wondering if that's something you or your colleagues have considered, Ben.
Well, it's something that we're looking into because back in the tobacco litigation in the 90s, the insurance companies brought some of that litigation themselves, in fact, because they were bearing the costs of the tobacco catastrophe. And so insurance companies might be bearing costs due to climate change as well. And so that's another interesting angle to look into.
Right, I've written a fair bit on the reinsurance industry, the guys who insure the insurance companies, and they are very concerned indeed. And ultimately, insurance companies aren't going to get the backing of reinsurance. So, I mean, John, you've written about the promise of climate litigation in Fire Weather, your book. So could you talk a bit about what it is that excites you about Ben's work?
To me, the law and also insurance have an authoritative way of identifying and isolating and basically indicating in language that will obviously hold up, in court, but also hold up in a rational system for how this is different, why this is specifically so, who is specifically responsible. I think and there's also, there's a language to the law that is so disciplined and crisp. And most of us are kind of out here in this, it's more of a miasm of intersecting energies and dynamics across time and space and different media. And the law has been very good, as science is also very good, at identifying and basically bringing these particular elements into focus so that we can see them without the clouding influences of daily life and all the other systems that they influence. And so it's kind of going into the crowd and saying, it was you come forward and tell us about what you did back there. Instead of, I think they want to disappear into the crowd and say, hey, it's the market, or hey, we're just providing what people want. But actually, no, you're making decisions in the boardroom. You, sir, and you, ma'am, just had this conversation. And we can see the influence that you're trying to wield behind the scenes with lobbyists. And I think that would be another thing, is just to get tallies of man and woman hours of lobbying time from the petroleum industry. And I think when you start adding that up, it almost looks like harassment, in terms of the degree and intensity with which they lean on politicians. That's certainly the case in Canada, and I know it is in the U.S., I believe, and probably the U.K. So there's so many different ways to, if we can isolate those pieces of information, I think they could all support each other. So if you had evidence from the insurance industry, the number of lobbying hours, particular quotes from CEOs where they say in very bald and kind of unconcerned ways how focused they are on a particular objective that is completely at odds with the needs of our collective safety on Earth.
Yes, I was wondering if it is it the specificity of law that sort of sets it apart in this fight, Ben, that is able to define these parameters? Is that the power of law? What really got you into this?
But law is interesting and powerful in a couple of different ways. I mean, I've had the opportunity to work as a scientist and as an historian and as a lawyer, and all these disciplines and practices bring different strengths. But I think one thing that's special about the law is that because of the adversarial system, it's a relatively level playing field because everyone has to play by these particular rules. So it's not entirely level. I mean, everyone sort of knows that who's dealt with, the legal system. It's not entirely fair, and sometimes it's really unfair. But in terms of taking to task powerful interests, it's one of the only forums in society where that's possible. I think what John is doing is another forum because that's in some sense the court of public opinion, which which that's the place where the narratives and the stories are created that form our whole reality in terms of our societal imagination. And in a sense, the courts flow from that. So, I think that's even more powerful in some sense. But in terms of you know, getting the truth into the public sphere and having resolution, the law is very powerful. We need resolutions to this problem, and the future is depending on our ability and willingness to do that during our lifetimes now. So those are some powerful things about law. I think another powerful thing is that it has the power to get the truth out there through things like legal discovery. This is why we know so much about the tobacco industry, is because of legal discovery, which revealed its many secrets, and we have something like 100 million internal documents from the from the tobacco industry because of legal discovery. And so it can reveal what is secretly occurring behind the scenes. And we need to know that with climate change too, because we need to know, what solutions are real, what solutions are hyped, for example. What has the industry been doing for these past decades? Why haven't we made more progress? And we need to be able to see those things so we can remove those roadblocks and make better progress. So those are some things I see the law as being able to provide in this space.
You mentioned there redefining or defining our reality, and to that point, Ben, I've been recently reading Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson's new book, What If We Get It Right? And towards the end, Ayanna talks about the way she imagines how we might live if we do get it right in the struggle against climate change and against, indeed, these companies. One of her premises begins, if we get it right, the combustion phase of humanity is over. So I'd like to ask, what's your answer to the question, what if we get it right?
There are some ways this could go wrong, and there's some ways this could go better. And one is that we have an industry which over the past 40 years has intentionally caused a global catastrophe or a global emergency, whatever words you like. And there aren't that many industries that have that power in human history, where in the span of a single generation of human beings, they can cause irreversible changes to the planet that will last for, thousands of years, essentially forever on a human time scale, and cause mass extinctions and things like that, right? That's what the fossil fuel industry has done. And that's what other industries could do too in the future, unless we say that this is just not okay, and that we have the legal mechanisms and government's mechanisms and also the collective social imagination to have a story about that and have a story about this is what that looks like, and this is not allowed or this is not okay. Because I fear that if we let this slide, global warming, then what else can happen? I mean, we already see an emerging plastics pollution crisis and forever chemicals pollution crisis and so on. Many of them are connected to the fossil fuel industry or part of it. But this might not be the last global pollution crisis that we face. So if we get this right, it might help us for many centuries perhaps to come.
I'd like to ask the same question to you, John, while we have the time. What do you imagine lies beyond the combustion phase of humanity, as you put it?
I mean, if we were able to honestly grapple with that and succeed in the energy transition, which is literally underway right now. We are in an energy transition. The petroleum industry knows that. Many people who live in states, nations, towns where that is underway are really feeling it, and most people are for it. And I think it's happening faster than is easy to calculate because, as William Gibson said, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so, the energy transition is not distributed very well where I live in Canada, but in Texas, which is a petroleum-heavy, quite conservative state that does not smile on tree huggers. They are leading the continent in renewable energy rollout. And you'd think California would be doing that, or New York would be doing that in North America. But Texas is, by a Texas country mile, is leading the charge there. And so I think we may be surprised where we find allies and movement. It's not all going to be, driven by lawsuits. There's also a demonstrably practical motive to making these changes. And look at Paris under Mayor Hidalgo. She's changing the transportation and the humanity, if you will, of that city in real time. And anyone who's been there over the past 100 years has always known it to be choked with traffic, choked with smog, noisy, chaotic, slow moving. And now streets and the humans who move upon them are having a very different experience. And so if we can, change energy grids in an environment the size of Texas, and change human transportation and the way that we relate to each other, the way we relate to movement, the way we relate to shopping and mobility in general, in a city as central culturally and as large as Paris, I think that should, and these are just a couple of examples of tremendous strides that are being made literally like in the 2020s. It's not even a 21st century thing, just in this decade, this is happening. Meanwhile, we are also measurably departing from the Holocene, and we're moving into a post-Holocene instability that is probably going to intensify and accelerate also during the 2020s. And that is, going to be really hard to walk back from. So we are, again, we're almost, that's maybe the nature of the times we live in, of being in these sort of parallel realities where you have a financial system really focusing on pleasing shareholders. Meanwhile, they're perpetrating impacts on the planet that are going to make it harder for those shareholders to live, and ultimately. And meanwhile, we're also, remaking cities, remaking energy grids in ways that could benefit us for the next 1,000 years, even as storms grow measurably more severe, heat waves grow measurably more intense and lethal. And so it's really, we've never been here before in a period of such dynamism and such possibility, but it's kind of shadowed by such menace. And it's going to take real fortitude and courage. But I think, we have that. And that is something that actually humans have in spades. We've been through so many trials in our history.
John, do you have any other questions for Ben at this point?
What's the case you're most excited about now?
Well, I see three areas that are really promising right now. So one is the climate damages lawsuits that are happening mostly in the US right now. A bunch of cities and states and counties have sued fossil fuel companies like Exxon and Chevron and Shell for climate damages and adaptation costs, very similar to tobacco or opioid litigation. So there's a model for success there. And those cases have been moving forward steadily through the legal system. And now the Supreme Court of the US is looking at them. The oil companies have appealed the cases to the Supreme Court. So everyone's waiting to see what will happen with those cases, but they're very high stakes, and they've been successful so far. So we'll see what happens as they move forward. But I think a few other areas are, one is the human rights area, and this year and next year we're going to see some of the international human rights courts give their legal opinions about climate change and human rights, and that will affect the law in many countries around the world. Um, and that will probably strengthen a lot of these lawsuits we're seeing in different countries that are trying to force governments to decarbonize, to make decarbonization policy, to move away from fossil fuels in alignment with the Paris Agreement. And those lawsuits are also being developed against companies too, like the Shell case in the Netherlands, which where a court ordered Shell, the big oil company, to basically cut in half the amount of fossil fuels it produces by 2030. So that's a major legal development that's under appeal now as well. So that's a whole area that's moving. And then I think the third one is like this greenwashing litigation. I mean, I think we've all seen, these advertisements that say, the airplane's running on banana peels, or Exxon is a solar company now, or they're doing carbon capture. I see that all the time. Like, Exxon is doing carbon capture. And, I'm a former historian, and, for a long time, the oil companies were just outright denying the existence of climate change and the connection to fossil fuels, mostly in the 1990s. But since the year 2000, it's mostly been greenwashing. It's mostly been saying, we're on it, don't worry. And I'm hopeful that the law can, put a stop to that, can create some legal standard that says, okay, if that's really what those companies are doing, then they should prove it.
What Alex Steffen calls predatory delay. He's a futurist out of Berkeley, and that term is so, kind of like the malignant the malignant normality. And that is, predatory delay is what they've practiced with enormous success. And in Canada, believe it or not, there has been some real progress around legal prohibitions against greenwashing and certain types of advertising. And it's actually changed the makeup of their websites now and the claims being made on it. So we're finding chinks in the armor and again, getting some real leverage there. And that is, that's obviously a huge piece of it, just the public face not being able to mask itself.
Do you have anything else you'd like to ask John?
I'm just fascinated by how to tell stories about climate change, because climate change is so all-encompassing, it's enormous, there's a lot of ways to think about it. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you think about telling the story of climate change? What do you think is the next great untold story about climate change?
I don't really know the answer. I'm so still preoccupied with fire, weather, and fire. And it's been almost 18 months now since the book has been out. And I've been, I'm at a festival right now. I'm going to another one in 2 days. And people really want to talk about that. And so that has really preoccupied me. But I think what has kept me busy with this is the human face of that book. And so, this is going back to our superpower, which is acting in community. And so, I was talking to somebody last night. We were at a very long table and there was, strangers there. But if somebody at the other end of the table went into some kind of distress or burst into tears, even if we didn't know them, we would go to them. That's, we are really beautiful that way. Almost everybody, would go to help somebody, even if it was a total stranger. And so in terms of conveying the impacts of climate change in a way that touch people, I think what made Fire Weather effective was kind of telling it through oil workers and firefighters, and sort of leaving the climate out of it and just going to the fact these are folks who are in deep distress. This colossal fire has come in. We now know, that's broken the temperature record that day by 6 degrees, and it's as dry as Death Valley, but we're in the boreal forest of the subarctic. And so we know things are really not right. And now here are these people who we have compassion for and will develop even admiration for, trying to deal with these, really unnatural and truly terrible circumstances. And then, so as we get to know them and really want them to prevail in this battle that is so clearly against them, and in which they are clearly overmatched, I think just subconsciously we can't help but identify. And that's what I think compassion and that identification of like, oh my gosh, are they going to get out? What about his kid? God, he left his passport. But what's he going to do? And that concern, we can, and a story gives us a safe place to have those feelings where it might feel too confrontational on the street or in a public forum. But I think that the value of the book and the value of those kind of stories are a place where we can kind of test out those emotions and test out the ideas, and nobody's watching. So, you can read about climate change even if you are, or the impacts of climate, even if you are in a petroleum town where speaking out about the activities of the oil company could get you censured, could get you fired, could compromise your position in that community. And again, our position in the community is the most important thing to us generally. And so I think that's why you don't have a lot of people speaking out about climate in oil towns, even if they recognize the science, because their social position matters more. Their day-to-day survival is what that's what that influences. So, but in the form of a story where we can reach way beyond our comfort zone and our familiar geography and sociology into this other place and find these commonalities and realize, my gosh, they're really, they're really in caught, getting ground up between these two realities. One, the need to have a job. The other, in this industry that is actually making their lives demonstrably less safe. That kind of opens the question, and we need to start somewhere. And I think with these stories, we can begin to explore, wow, what would I do? How does that make me feel? How do I actually feel about those people? Those are oil workers who I may have certain judgments about, but actually that guy was pretty cool, and I can't help but admire him. And I love my son the same way that man does. And so.
Thank you, John, and thank you for reminding us that responding to climate change and talking about it needs to be about humanity. It needs to be about compassion. And that's a powerful message in your book. I'd like to thank our star guests, John Valliant and Ben Franta. If you haven't already, please do go check out their work, linked in the description. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe to our channel, Climate Futures, and please do share it far and wide. I'm Dave Vetter, and our series producer is Liliana Resende. Climate Futures is brought to you by the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment and Oxford Digital Media. I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.